It's hard to believe it was during Lent last year that we stopped in-person worship. And here we are, it's Lent again, and the pandemic continues. No doubt this has been a difficult year for some much more than others. But to varying degrees, it has felt like a cross we've all borne. It's apt then that this year's Lenten readings are so focused on the cross. We often reflect on the cross theologically, but given this past year, I want to consider the cross from the viewpoint of Jesus. What motivated him? And how does that shape our spiritual experience, called as his disciples to take up our cross and follow him? We begin with John 15, which I chose rather than usual, Jesus in the wilderness, for this Sunday. I base the switch on one line. No one has greater love than to lay down their life for their friends. We tend to consider Jesus' death by its spiritual impact, but that one line, well, I heard a simpler motivation. Jesus loved his friends. They say that Jesus' death saves all of us, and in many ways it does. But ultimately, his decision not to resist arrest saved his friends, protected them from arrest and their own execution. No one has greater love, he says. We get this. A parent jumps in front of a car to save a child. A soldier rushes out to rescue a mate despite the crossfire. A miner risks her safety to dig out a coworker. Love trumps the instinct of self-preservation. We feel compelled by a deeper pull. And yet, as we consider the rest of the passage, especially when we do so alongside 1 Peter 3 and the excerpt from Dr. King's sermon, we realize that there's more than simple emotion at play. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. So what's the nature of that love? To answer, we should consider again the cross on our communion table. As I pointed out earlier, is decorated with a trillium. As a flower, it turns the cross into a tree of sorts, but the trillium also points to the Trinity. Medieval scholar Bonaventure used as a symbol for the Trinity, a water wheel. There's a flow of love, Father to Son, to Spirit to Father. Each receiving because each freely gives away. Without that constant giving away of self, there is no flow. And that same giving away is what made possible creation itself. Kabbalists, the mystics of Judaism, teach that the universe was made possible, creation made possible, because God withdrew. God let go a part of God's self to make space for the cosmos to be born. And that cosmos is held in the flow of love, like a fourth person of the Trinity. Creation receiving and creation giving itself away. On one level, Jesus' words, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you, are an invitation into that divine flow of love, that divine union that he experienced as beloved, a name proclaimed on the mountaintop, as we heard last week, and which, as Ian shared, an identity we all participate in. Jesus experienced this deeply each time he withdrew to a quiet place to pray. And this is something that we're much more intentional about each Lent, taking time for our own spiritual practice. It doesn't matter what we do as a meditative practice, but we do something. Listen to music, walk in nature, practice Lectio Divina, as we did at the beginning of our service. Anything to get out of our heads, to let go of ourselves, and so to open our hearts to that flow of love, and in turn to give that love away. And yet, if we're attentive, this is going to be a lot harder than we want it to be. As Jesus called his disciples to love each other as he has, to give themselves away in the pattern of the Trinity and of creation, well, the author of 1 Peter points to the true depth and challenge of this love. It's a difficult reading to hear in many ways, but this is the point I'd like to make. He writes how Christ suffered for the unrighteous, and then includes this odd reference to Christ appearing to the spirits in prison. At first read, I thought this referred to the idea that Jesus descended to the dead, as the image on icons with Jesus lifting Adam and Eve out of their tombs. A reminder that resurrection is for all of us, that all of us, including our ancestors, are beloved and freed into new life. I can accept that idea. But then I read further and realized that it wasn't Adam and Eve that is being referred to, but the spirits from Noah's time, that time of a mythological flood. And these spirits may refer to any number of things. They may refer to the mythic offspring of fallen angels and humans. They may be the descendants of Cain. Whoever they are in the story, they're the reasons why God floods the earth. And yet, Christ liberates them as well. The new life of the beloved given to those that I question are worthy of that love. And so this takes loving enemies to a much more challenging place, to another level altogether. I start to wonder who right now could provoke another divine deluge? Because there's an environmental deluge happening, and yet climate change deniers continue to speak, like those suggesting that wind power was responsible for Texans freezing in the dark last week. We know that our society is in crisis. White nationalists, they aren't fading away as we want them to. Our economy profits by people being trumped by money. Companies make money on youth, seniors, many others considered disposable. And these realities don't come out of nowhere. They have historical precedent. They're part of an historic pattern. It hits home for me as I begin to remember my own ancestors that profited off the slave trade, or my spiritual forebears who ran Indian residential schools. And I wonder, how on earth am I to love them, both in the past and in the present? I struggle with this. I confess that. Our world feels so enmeshed in division and enmeshed in fear. Henry Nouwen writes that our society seems to be increasingly full of fearful, defensive, aggressive people, inclined to look at their surrounding world with suspicion, always expecting an enemy to suddenly appear. But rather than draw away, he says that we need to reach out with love. The Christians must create a free and fearless space where brotherhood and sisterhood can be formed and fully experienced. Well, I can't do that if I keep denying that past enemies are part of my story. That denial makes it easier for me to keep present ones at arm's length, where they become an easy caricature, easily dehumanized and dismissed. We won't heal our world as long as we live in silos. Instead, we're called to engage others, hard as it is, called to listen with an open heart. It means giving myself away, including my assumption of total rightness and their complete wrongness. We won't be best friends. I don't think that's going to happen. But if I listen with compassion, I may discover ideas I'd never thought of before. And at least there will be some degree of dialogue, and I will have made space for growth in understanding. And more importantly, we will help heal a divided world. In the end, that's what it's about. Jesus' desire to reach out to the outsider led him to the cross. But from the cross, as Dr. King reminds us, he showed the true depth of that love, forgiving his executioners. Deep love, both human and divine, was the prime motivation of Jesus. And that same depth of love must be our prime motivation as well.